Why getting into punk rock was the most important thing that ever happened to me. It may sound crazy, but punk rock literally changed my life. Now, I've heard that statement before, and I'm sure you have too, but I mean it. I really mean that punk rock really changed and affected my life. Before I got into punk rock, I was mostly into whatever you would have saw on MTV at that time, and this would have been like the early 80s. I was into all the alternative stuff that you would have saw on MTV, Men at Work, Duran Duran, Adamant, whatever. And then I got into hard rock like Def Leppard, Quiet Riot, going a little heavier, getting into like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and stuff like that. And pretty much whatever MTV fed me is what I watched and what I ended up buying. And then I discovered punk rock. There was a guy who lived in my small town in Pennsylvania. I grew up in a small coal region town called Wilburton number 2. And it literally, Wilburton number 2. Wilburton number 1 was right down the street from us. We're talking one lane, 40 houses. And there was a guy who was a little bit older than me who was in the Navy. And he came back from the Navy. He was stationed over in England. And when he was over in England, he discovered punk rock. And I remember he had this tape collection in his car. And some of those tapes were the Ramones, Dead Kennedys, the Circle Jerks, Sex Pistols, and Devo, to name a few. And he let me borrow them. So I actually went home and taped them all, and I started listening to this stuff. And what turned me on to punk rock right off the bat was just how raw the music was. I'd never heard anything like this before. I remember hearing Black Flag's Damage, and I just, like, every song starts with feedback. There was, like, no bass in the recording. Rawest thing I've ever heard. And I loved it. I loved that the songs were very, very fast. A song could be like a minute and a half, and then there you go. That'd be it. I love that the Ramones had no guitar solos. And I love the message that the Dead Kennedys songs would give. Just a simple thing of just question authority. Or maybe thinking about things. Maybe thinking about that, like, well, maybe not everything is how it seems. So I got into punk rock. And what it made me start doing, well, you could buy most of this stuff at the mall, at a record store that you would find in a mall. But then I got into hardcore, New York hardcore to be exact. And I remember getting into like the Misfits. And I remember getting into music where there wasn't a tape. There wasn't a CD to buy. You had to buy a 7-inch, like literally a 7-inch record. And you couldn't buy those at the mall. You had to go to a music store that sold that stuff, like a punk rock store, an independent music store. And those were located in the cities. I lived about 2.5 hours north of Philadelphia. And I remember I would take the trip down to go record shopping in Philly to go find these records and stuff like that. But along with the music came the clothes. I remember wanting to get a pair of Doc Martens. I remember wanting to get like concert shirts or shirts of like punk rock bands that I liked. And you could not buy that anywhere except at like Zipperhead or Trash and Vaudeville or wherever. So all of a sudden I started finding myself going to cities to just buy the things that I wanted to buy. And then I started going to shows. A lot of the shows that I started going to were, of course, in cities. Growing up in Pennsylvania, I went to see a lot of shows in Philadelphia. Went up to New York City to see a lot of shows. The Lehigh Valley, Reading, Lancaster. Sometimes down to Baltimore. Sometimes up to Wilkes-Barre, wherever. And all of a sudden I find that I'm going to a city to do things more and more and more. Eventually I moved to New York City. So also around the same time as I got into punk rock, I was getting into other alternative types of music, like industrial, goth, or like synthwave kind of stuff. And again, everything that I was getting into wasn't the mainstream. You had to search it out a little bit. You have to be a little bit more open-minded to the music and to the messages at that as well. And it just kind of opened my mind, and it made me realize that there's a lot more out there than what you are fed on MTV or what you would read in like whatever the metal hard rock magazines would have been out at the time. And it made me start to appreciate other things that weren't considered like the norm. Like, for example, furniture. Like, I really, really love mid-century furniture. Definitely not in the norm. I got into tiki. That's definitely not in the norm. A lot of the things that I like are alternative things. There's subcultures of subcultures. A lot of that stemmed from being into punk rock. After living in New York for a couple of years, I moved out to Seattle, Washington. And one of the main reasons why I moved out here is a lot of my favorite bands were from Seattle. And I'm not even just talking about like the grunge bands of the time. I moved out here because I knew there was a lot of great music going on here. And I played guitar too. And I wanted to start my own band. And it seems like this would be the place to do it. So it's 2020. I live in Seattle. I've lived here for going on like 16, 17 years. And I got to thank the Ramones for that, because it was my love of music and searching it out and having to get out of my comfort zone, getting out of my little hometown in Pennsylvania to go see things that are outside of my little bubble. So I've lived out here in Seattle now for about 16, 17 years. And I gotta say, if it wasn't for getting into punk rock specifically, I would have never moved out here. I don't know if I would have ever left where I grew up. And music is important. And I think it shapes you a lot more than you think, or at least if you let it. If there's anything that I've learned from punk rock, is it just made me realize that there's more out there than what you know. And there's really, really cool stuff to discover, but you just have to go a little further, dig a little deeper to find these things. And yeah, punk rock has made me who I am today. Hey gang, this is Ray, and I just want to say thank you very much for checking out my video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to see more videos, please click on the subscribe button. And if you like what you see, please give it a like. That would mean a lot to me. And if you're wondering why I'm wearing Hawaiian shirts, well, when I'm not talking about records, I'm talking about my other love, Tiki. I have a show called Tiki with Ray. If you want to check that show out, just search Tiki with Ray on YouTube. It'll come up.